ClimateAction.tech is a community of tech professionals with the goal to inspire and empower each other to take climate action. And we run this call to share ideas and facilitate conversations within our community. And today we have Chris, who has a talk titled "To Go Green, Think Gold." And I'm just going to hand over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm saying hello from Berlin today. Because you are seeing a screen and not my face, this is what I look like. And this is the stuff, this is my background. I've worked in a string of wacky environmentally focused startups. But these days I spend my time split between three main organizations. First one is Icebreaker One, where we are basically, but as you can see, data infrastructure for net zero future. This is about sharing the data to allow people to either direct finance to the right place or price risk accordingly and properly. The other thing I do is I work with Spend Network, where our job is to analyze the $13 trillion of public spending that happens each year. And we are working to uncover the embedded carbon in this stuff to help direct public spending for the greatest carbon emissions for the costs possible. The final thing I do is I am one of the directors of the Green Web Foundation. And as you can tell from the name, we want to make the web green. And this is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this session. So this is what we're going to cover. I'm going to share a mental model on why I think these are useful and show some examples of this, both in climate and then with the web as digital kind of technologists and practitioners. I'm going to share this model, Gold, which I'm still working on, and I'm not sure if it's quite right. It might become Fold later on, and I'll share why later. And then finally, we'll open this up for questions so I can get some feedback from y'all across the world, because I think there's a decent number of time zones watching right now. Okay, so first of all, I need to be really explicit that there are other issues when we think about sustainability and designing for digital, but I'm going to focus on climate change and carbon. So I know there's a big, scary thing happening with biodiversity, and there's loads of other things beyond this. But for the purposes of this salon, I'm going to focus primarily on carbon, all right? And hopefully we'll be explain why that's the case. And I think I've shown this slide twice. I'm just going to skip over that and pretend that that didn't quite happen. So this is my take on this. We are largely in a climate crisis because we keep burning fossil fuels instead of finding a path off them. Now, I'm showing it like this to make it this simple, because I think having a very, very simple narrative is useful when you're actually trying to make a case with people about why they should be changing or the way they might think about what they do or change their processes. And I need to refer back to, I mean, you don't need to listen to take my word for it. You can actually look at the source material. Now, these words, rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented, these are the words that are in the guidance for policymakers from the IPCC. Now, if you understand anything about mild-mannered scientists, when they say rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented, that is like them grabbing you by the ears and screaming in your face to please do something now because they're sick of jumping up and down. But because scientists are often a kind of understated bunch, they resort to saying rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented. But we need to bear this in mind because these are the scope of the changes that we're talking about, that we face to meet the scale of the climate crisis. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about the internet here, and I'm going to present the internet as the biggest machine in the world. I think it's a useful way to think about it, and it's also useful to think to be aware that yes, it still mostly runs on fossil fuels. And I think I keep coming back to this idea of fossil fuels because I'm going to put to you that the problem we face isn't that the internet is growing too fast or that use it or anything like that. The problem is that every time we use the internet, it results in carbon emissions because we end up burning fossil fuels when we use this. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a fact check. So this is a chart from the IEA, the International Energy Agency. So and it basically shows that since 2010 to 2020, basically, we've seen a massive increase in, say, data center use and use of the internet, but the actual energy use has largely stayed the same. It's around like 2%, which is the same as, say, shipping or aviation. But if you consider all of the value and all of the improved quality of life that we've actually had for that 2%, I think that's a pretty good deal. And I think, I don't think the answer is to just stop using the internet, partly because I'm speaking to loads of people who are actually employed by working with the internet. But I also think that it's more useful to have a better narrative than what we have right now. And I think there is a kind of weird techno-puritanism that I think is going to be is easy to fall into. However, there's a few things to bear in mind. The shift that we've seen with the internet to kind of come to stay at this constant level of usage is that we've ended up with a massive consolidation of power amongst a small number of organizations. And that has its own kind of far-reaching effects. Now, in this deck, every single slide has a bunch of extra links for this. So if you want to kind of dive into things in a bit more detail, then that's available to you. So I'm going to talk about mental models now as an aid for thinking. Now, it's really important to remember that mental models they're all wrong, but some of them are useful for help guiding some activity or helping you make a decision. So if you talk about kind of climate, we'll often talk about, say, carbon emissions, how to track them. The most common way of doing this is the way of using scoped emissions. So this is like the gold standard for measuring the climate impact of any organization, really. And you can think of it in terms of scope 1, as you see here, burning, and I use coffee or hot beverages as a way to help kind of remember this stuff. So scope 1 is you say burning coal or usually gas for, say, hot beverages, so you can have a cup of tea. Scope 2 is electricity. So that's someone else burning fossil fuels on your behalf so that you can have power to heat up water. And scope 3 is your entire supply chain. That's like you walking into a coffee shop. Do you remember them? Where you can actually pay someone else to take care of the act of getting coffee to you so you can drink that. All right. Now, this is useful because it helps us think about where we might make changes or how organizations might need to change what they do if they wanted to decarbonize and reduce their emissions. So this is Amazon. So their carbon footprint in 2018, as you can see, is 44 million tons. So that's like an extra Finland existing. And most of their emissions are in scope 3, their supply chain. So when they talk about buying loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of electric vans, you can see why it will make sense for them to do that. Now, if you look at Google, for example, Google have a much higher scope 2. So the thing they probably need to do, and the thing they have been doing, probably as one of the leaders, is actually investing a load of money in renewable energy to put this on the grid. Now, these charts that you see here show you two things. This shows you Google's emissions without kind of buying renewable energy to account for the power it's using on the grid. And it also shows that, well, basically it shows that this is where Google would make the most sense, why they're investing so much money in renewables over something else, for example. And let's see if I can just get to this, 2 seconds, folks. Yeah, if you have heard of Stripe, can I just get a wave if you've heard of Stripe, the company here? Anyone here? Okay, cool. So Stripe is more like a lot of the companies I imagine some of you would be working in. And because you are not running your own infrastructure or running your own data centers like Google or as much, your emissions will probably be in scope 3. So this is a mental model to help you think about this stuff and then see where you might prioritize if you were trying to redesign a service or anything like that. Now, I'm going to point to an example of another mental model in another domain, because I think it's actually quite useful for us to bear this in mind. If you work with accessibility, there is a phrase called POUR, which is actually referenced in the WCAG, essentially like the gold standard for accessibility that websites need to actually follow if they do not want to be sued as public organizations and increasingly private organizations. Now, POUR stands for perceivable, operable, usable, and robust. Perceivable is the idea that you can, if you cannot see something, you can at least perceive the features of a website or perceive the content in some way. So you would need to make that accessible in more than one way, which is often like making text available and things like that. Operable is something that you can actually access and you can use a website, so you can operate a website in more than one way. So the example here might be, say, something that works with a mouse, but also works with a keyboard. And there are ways of checking for this. Usable is the idea that, is it actually intuitive enough for you to understand how to be using this kind of stuff? And the final thing, robust, is this idea that if you do not have precisely the right kind of technology, can you still access this? And this is one advantage of the web and like the web of like the older days, as it were, compared to some of the extremely kind of JavaScript heavy single page apps that we might have, which are kind of quite brittle by comparison. The web degrades quite nicely in many ways. So if you are on a slow connection, you can still see text, whereas for lots of applications, that's not the case anymore. And poor is useful. And this is a quote from the WebAim website, which I found quite helpful, and why this is actually such a kind of common phrase in accessibility circles. So the idea is to create a poor website. The pun may be a bad one, but if it helps people memorize this, then it served its purpose. So having a rubric or a mental model is actually quite useful for this. And this is my key kind of, I guess, question, or what I'm going to try and do with your attention today. I think it would be useful for us to have something like poor, but for designing websites in a more carbon-aware way. Because yes, we're in a climate crisis. So here's what I'm proposing. I'm proposing GOLD, which stands for green, open, lean, and distributed. Now, this is based on a number of ideas, and we've been working on it a few times. And if this is of interest to you, I'd really recommend checking out principles.green, where Asim Hussain, one of the other organizers, has been working on a similar model to try and make it easier for people to act upon this kind of wish to build more sustainable, planet-friendly, humane tools, I suppose. So let's go through these. G is for green. So green energy, as in as low carbon as possible. Now, I'm going to break this into two sections. There's one of them which is running on green energy. And I've just spoken to you about Google and about renewable power and why that's a key thing. So I won't spend too much time on that. The other thing is that things can be also made from green energy. And this is because when we think about electronics are largely sand plus IP plus lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of energy. So with this in mind, it's useful to bear in mind, because if we can decarbonize the energy that we use to make things, then we can reduce the reduce the emissions. Or if we can make something last longer, then we can have an impact this way. So Fairphone is a good example of this, where they basically designed their Fairphone to be user serviceable, so you'd hold on to it for longer. And this basically has an impact because it's so energy intensive to make the initial handset that the best thing they can do is design it so that you don't need to replace an extremely energy intensive part until you can decarbonize the energy. So this is like one thing that you do actually have. The other option is open. And I'm using the phrase open not in a kind of really, really dogmatic way, but more as a kind of idea or approach that you might use. So one example is the Open Compute project. Now, this was initially put together and launched by Facebook in 2011, but now has a number of people working on this, like Microsoft as an example, who actually work on this. And the general idea is having a kind of shared public commons of intellectual property that you can use to design more efficient data centers, so that, well, there's two reasons. A, to avoid Amazon getting too much of a lead, but the other reason is that it's actually very, very green, because you reduce the amount of energy that you do use. There's a really good piece by Jessie Frazell where she speaks all about this and about all the things that you can actually do and where all the optimizations are. But this is an example of like an open approach, which I think is actually useful to bear in mind. The other thing is open data. So Electricity Map is an example of this. They collect open data that's published by governments all around the world, and they put a nice API. So you can have cool maps like this to understand where energy is particularly carbon intensive or not. And then you can use that to basically decide to serve different experiences or change what you might do or change how you use compute as a result of this. So become green, open. Now lean, if you do, at some point we will need to actually emit carbon. And this is what I'm proposing here. This is an idea that I think we don't really have a good framework for this right now that covers this, but I wanted to draw attention to this idea of the energy onion, because in energy circles, there's a lot of parallels between the conversations that are happening right now about making a smart grid with how we think about the internet works. And loads of the things you might do to, say, prevent the need to make a network request and download a big video or something there are lots of parallels with the energy sector right now. they have this idea that you should focus on energy efficiency first, and then you should try to use as much energy internally as you can before you get things from the grid, with the idea being that you try as much as you can to avoid making these kinds of requests. And I think this way of thinking about energy efficiency first, then working through this is actually quite useful. And I think we could apply it ourselves. We don't really actually have a good way to frame it right now, but I think this is actually it'd be really good to have something like this for having a kind of consistent way of talking about, say, performance optimization, deciding what you do next, and so on from there. But I can show how some of this might work if you look after websites. So there are tools like Google Lighthouse, which will basically analyze a website for you and tell you how good it is based on various criteria that Google grade you on. Now, this is cool, and it's often very, very useful to have a fast site. But the thing is, there are also all these kind of values associated that Google might have, which might not be the same as yours. So I think that tools like, say, Lighthouse are actually quite useful, because they might have a focus on things like privacy and things which might not be quite such a focus for a company that's primarily based on having advertising, and in some ways quite intrusive advertising. So that is so I actually am spending a bit of time working with Sitespeed to build some sustainable plugins for this, so that you can understand the environmental impact of this and start analyzing this kind of stuff. And this idea, I basically decided to try to contribute to an existing open source project, partly because there's a load of work on there, but also so that we could see these ideas in other products and other tools. And like, we are seeing things like that now. So there's a tool called Cabin, which is an alternative to Google Analytics that you can use, that will allow you to kind of analyze, say, websites, give you an idea of the carbon footprint of any digital websites or any websites that you have. Now, the cool thing is they will identify pages which are particularly heavy, so you can actually highlight these, speak to other developers and say, hey, can we do something about this? Because there is one thing that we need to focus on first. Now, in this case here, this is the Green Web Foundation website, and I'm kind of embarrassed to show you this because our news page is awful. It's giant, way too big, but having something like this gave me a chance to realize where I need to focus on first. So I've spoken about G, O, and L. The final one is distributed, and this is a bit sci-fi, and probably the least, the one that is probably the biggest leap to kind of get your head around, I suppose. So it's this idea of moving the work that you might do, or computers might do on your behalf, to different times or different parts of the world to avoid carbon emissions. And there's some things you can do on a geographic scale. So what you're looking at here is a map of, say, Amazon, say Amazon's data centers. Some of these are green, some of these are not green. And depending on where you choose to run work or cite a website, you can basically make measurable changes to the emissions associated with digital products that you do have. The other thing you might do is move things through time. Now, as you can see, not every, and this is a sketch from Asim Hussein's principles.green website. The idea is that renewable energy on the grid, the carbon intensity, the amount of renewables on the grid will change at different times, simply because sometimes it's windy, sometimes the sun is in the sky, sometimes it isn't. And you can use this to and if you know this, you might choose to not run some jobs which are important but not urgent, to have them run at a different time. And this is essentially what large buildings do these days to reduce their own emissions for energy. You'll find large buildings will now switch on the air conditioning at, say, 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. because the energy is cheap and relatively green there. So when people turn up at 8 or 9 o'clock, or when they used to turn up at 8 or 9 o'clock, the building is cool enough, and they've done it for less cost, but also for less carbon. We can do the same thing with data centers and with the work that we actually do at a computing level. And this is essentially what Google are doing right now, where they got a lot of plaudits for shifting their workloads around this, because they have so many machines that they can do this. But you can also do this at a kind of client side. This is an example, some work by a recent graduate from the RCA, the Royal College of Art, Lucia Ye. Sorry. She basically designed, this is the kind of concept for a kind of video chat alternative, where when you're in an area which is has high grid intensity and lots of fossil fuels on the grid, it drops down to not use video, but use other ways of having some kind of intimacy with someone. So this is like a video call with the idea that you might be able to kind of show your touch with someone else. And this is the example of her having a call with her mum and basically like touching the pad and the other person being able to see that. So there's other ways of being able to communicate, to connect, which aren't relying on video. So this is the idea: green, open, lean, distributed. I would really like to get some feedback to see if it's actually of use to you, or if you can imagine applying any of this to where you work. And I'm just going to give you a recap now, if I may. I think it's quite useful to think in terms of carbon if you for this stuff. And I think carbon awareness as a concept is actually really, really important, basically because this is what the scientists are saying we should be tracking. So I think it's useful. I think it's also useful to think about the climate crisis being about fossil fuels. So if we could actually, if I could wave a magic wand, I would wish that we could stop talking in terms of carbon free, but talk about fossil free and realize that that is the thing that we need to change. And finally, for green, think gold. And I think I've run out of slides, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But I hope that was interesting to you folks. And yeah, I've shared the link in the chat already. So I'm going to stop now. And yeah,